Die Mama schließt sich an und weißt du, sie sagt dir.
Mom is joining in and wants to tell you that she didn't really manage to tell you in her life that she loves you. She never said I love you, let alone showed you how proud she is of you. She couldn't do that. Her prince was her son. And today she's come to tell you she's proud of you.
Sie ist stolz auf dich.
A flower seance with Martina Mikołajczyk-Touch on Lanzarote. Mediumistic contact with the afterlife is one of the most controversial topics when it comes to death and grief. Those affected are convinced that it is possible to receive messages from the deceased in this way. Outsiders, on the other hand, reflexively suspect fraud and rip-offs. Objective evidence is difficult to provide, but one thing is clear. Mediumistic contacts have a lasting effect on people. And there is impressive documentation of this. Shortly before closing time, which was around 4:35 or 4:40 p.m, I just went to our yard, we have a small craft business, and wanted to check on the people. I wanted to know what had happened during the day. Someone called me and told me that my son Fritz had fallen near the fire station. I didn't think anything of it. I thought he'd tripped, and I talked to a few people first and then said I'd go there. When I got to the fire station, there was already a huge crowd there, an ambulance, everything was there. My wife and my other child were already there, and I joined them. My wife said that Fritz had something in his heart. The ambulance was there and they were trying to revive him. And that took half an hour, 3/4 of an hour. There was also a trained first aider on site immediately. I later learned about the extent of the rescue attempts. They tried everything in the ambulance for an hour and then said there was really no point. But because he is such a young person, they took him to the hospital and tried everything there. Then I took care of our 11-year-old daughter first and waited until my mum came home and then drove after her. My wife travelled with me in the ambulance. And when I arrived at the hospital, my wife came to meet me and said, well, she said that the doctors had just told me that Fritz hadn't made it. A bitter time began for Thomas Wenk and his wife. Fritz was missing. There were no words to express their grief for him, but remarkable coincidences began to accumulate in everyday life. Thomas Wenk discovered a heart-shaped hair on his PC. The next morning, his wife found an almost identical one on the breakfast table. When the farewell party was due and the grieving father was getting dressed for it, the bedroom was lit up by the most intense dawn light. Similar coincidences followed. Were these signs actual after-death contacts that so many people report? Or was it all just imagination, wishful thinking that eased the grief? Thomas Wenk came across Annika Scheller on the internet. She had also lost her child, but was convinced that contact with the afterlife was possible.
Annika Scheller die Miriam Winkler empfohlen.
Annika Scheller then recommended Miriam Winkler to us. I wrote to her because her appointments were fully booked. Dear Mrs. Winkler, my son had been in an accident. And then she wrote back to me in her snippy way, Dear Mr. Wenk, your son actually wanted to tell me all that himself, but he's creative. He'll think of something.
Unfortunately, he mentioned in the email, my son has gone into the spiritual world. Although it says in capital letters on my homepage that I don't want any information about the client who contacts me, or about the deceased. No information at all. But Mr. Wenk was very generous. So in this case, I knew that someone had died suddenly. And then I felt into it and got the impulse that it was really important for us to meet before Christmas. So I wrote back to the Wenk family. In retrospect, he said, very snotty. Dear Mr. Wenk, there is actually already information in the email which your son actually wanted to give me as proof. But he is creative. You will get an appointment. I think it was just before Christmas, the 22nd or 21st of December. But only if you come to me, here on site.
And then, 6 weeks after it happened, we got an appointment with Miriam Winkler on 20th of December. We then travelled to Hüfenhut, and from then on, the world was a different place.
It had only been 2 months at most since the son's passing. They were in deep mourning, energetically very withdrawn and upset. And of course, I was also a bit tense, because I already had 2 or 3 pieces of information, which, if I hadn't known about it, would have been great proof for me and for the son.
Ja, und dann war...
And then Fritz, that's the son's name, came and spent 2 hours giving me information. Details which I really couldn't have known.
Then she also said quite clearly that Fritz was grabbing his heart. She could see that he was immediately on the floor. She saw that the soul was out of his body before he was on the ground. She sees that helpers were there immediately from the very first moment. She sees a road and public transport, opposite the fire station or the bus station and the railway station. She sees that he was immediately in the ambulance, that first aid was there, that there was nothing we could do.
Fritz showed me something else afterwards. He said, "Miriam, look at my chest." And I said, "For God's sake, Fritz, what have they done to your chest?" And then he said, "They resuscitated me to death." And yes, that's what I learned after. They resuscitated him for an hour and a half.
Mrs. Winkler gave us one piece of information after another in 2.5 hours, including the fact that our son had to stop playing football at the age of 12.
I knew he had collapsed on the way to volleyball training. And the son then showed me that he used to play football and that you could no longer play football because something was wrong with his foot. He had a foot deformity. And he showed me something like a screw or a plate. And I couldn't understand that at first. He was on his way to play volleyball, and now he's telling me that he shouldn't be doing any sport at all? And that's when I learned, okay, put your mind to the side. And the information was true about the health issues that he already had as a child, which I had no way of knowing about. And the family sat there completely perplexed.
And we sat there, and then she started telling us one thing after another. She told us that Fritz wasn't like other young people, that he preferred classical music to other music. That's true. That he had exactly 2 friends, and that a lot of things from his life that were just as true. He was actually relatively mature in his thoughts for his age. As I said, he preferred going to the theatre to doing anything else. He wasn't in a gang. He was determined to find his own way. And she described Fritz's character to us as he really was or is. And the thing with his feet. She said that your son had to stop playing football because he had problems with his feet. And Fritz really did have screws put in his feet during an operation and had to stop playing football for that reason. And those were just a few of many examples. There was a real firework display of arguments for 2 hours.
And then we also wrote with Fritz. I remember that. I have a writing planchette, a writing instrument, and I showed them how the spiritual world can also communicate via a writing medium. My partner cooked for me that evening. I remember, so I actually had a time limit. But Fritz kept us talking for so long that at some point the Wenk family asked, "Don't you actually have to go home?" And then I said, "I do." The food was overcooked at that point, and I had a bit of an argument with my partner. But it was worth it, because the family told me afterwards, "You saved our Christmas." Without you, Mr. Wenk told me, and he stands by that, I don't think I would still be here, because I wanted to follow my son. And then I also understood why it was so important to his son to make this appointment possible before Christmas.
And when we left there, just before Christmas, I saw life in my wife's eyes again for the first time. She had hope for the first time. She called her mum, spoke to her for an hour, and was totally thrilled and beside herself. And then, after the appointment with Miriam Winkler, we were completely back on track. From then on, the belief that life after death could be possible, or is possible, became a certainty. His conviction has changed Thomas Wenk. Someone who had nothing to do with spiritual matters was now actively campaigning for the appreciation of mediumistic work at public events. Professor Oliver Lazar felt the same way.
Von Haus aus bin ich ja Naturwissenschaftler, Technikwissenschaftler.
I am a natural scientist by training, a technical scientist, and I lived in this materialistic worldview for 43 years of my life. But then there was a key event that turned everything I had learned upside down. I had a lot to do with the natural sciences during my medical studies. Especially in the foundation course, you have a lot of biology, physics, chemistry, biochemistry and physiology. And of course, these are all wonderful sciences that have grown over the years, decades and centuries. And the findings have been collected by doctors and professors using scientific methods. Why should you ever question these things that you learn at school, at university? And in the same way, it was never an issue for me to engage with spirituality. I have never rejected it. There are scientists who actively reject such things. That wasn't the case for me. It was just never an issue. But then, in 2017, there was an event that, as I said, turned everything on its head. I drove my daughter to school on the 9th of October 2017. She was in 8th grade, 13 years old, and on the way to school, we witnessed an accident. A large concrete mixer, a lorry, turned off and ran over a cyclist. We saw the people running around frantically and then providing first aid. What we didn't see at first was who was involved. That only became clear a little later, because my daughter came home an hour or two later. She rushed in and shouted that it was Yoma. So, a classmate of hers had died in this accident, a fatal accident. And that was, of course, an event that not only affected me, but of course the whole class, and occupied them for a long time. What was a bit extraordinary for me was that the moment I found out about it, I felt a depth of grief that I had never known before in my life. An indescribable grief, a grief that tore the ground from under my feet. My heart was torn apart, my world collapsed. And of course, you might think that this is completely normal compassion. It certainly was. But I didn't even know this girl. She wasn't my daughter's best friend. I may have seen her once or twice at a school event, but I never spoke to her or had any contact with her, so I didn't know her at all. But I still felt this indescribably deep sadness. And then something happened a week or two after the accident that really changed my life completely. And it was a feeling that you can hardly describe. There are actually no words that can describe what I experienced. Many people who have a near-death experience talk about similar things, but I didn't know anything about it. I wasn't interested in spiritual topics. I didn't even know what feelings there could be. And the whole thing basically started with an inner vibration and incredible goosebumps that ran up and down the left side of my body. And I was suddenly flooded with such immense love. You can't put it into words. It was a love that I had never felt before in my life. And it was as if the whole universe was radiating. I perceived light, but it was pleasant, and it was nothing that I should have questioned in any way. because it came to me with such genuineness, with such distinctiveness, that I would never question it. And of course, that kind of blew me away, because I thought, what was that? I couldn't categorize it at all. I had tears of joy running down my face. And on the other hand, I had this immense sadness inside me. It really was such a roller coaster ride of emotions. How did I suddenly go from this immense sadness to this immense love?
Were there any other experiences on your personal path, on your journey, that somehow made it clear to you why this particular feeling of grief and later love came about?
Yes, I wouldn't have been able to cope with it all on my own. A few months after the accident, I went to a medium, Nina Herzberg, and booked an aura reading there. Basically, I wanted to have a little chat with her. What were the experiences I had there? How can I explain them? And in the conversation, something else crystallized, something I hadn't expected. The aura reading more or less didn't take place, because the appointment then developed into a contact with the afterlife. Nina Herzberg then said, I have a girl here who shows me that she died in a bicycle accident. Can you do anything with that?
But she didn't know anything about this incident.
Exactly. She didn't know anything about it. Then I said, of course, I understand. I can do something with that. I was extremely surprised because I thought I wasn't entitled to any contact with the afterlife here. The girl doesn't even know me. But then Nina gave me more information. The girl proved herself as well as she could. I hardly knew her. She described the outward appearance. She described seeing her riding a horse. I knew that, for example. I knew she was a passionate rider. That was wonderful evidence. I was extremely happy about this contact. Nina said she was now showing me a 1 and a 1. Can you do anything with that? I said no, not at first. Maybe an 11? Nina said no, that's clearly a 1 and a 1. I then checked the phone number, date of birth. Nothing matched. I said, I don't know now. Nina said she didn't know either, but that wasn't a problem. It usually clears up afterwards. That's what happened. I went to Joma's parents a few weeks later and told them that the medium had shown a 1 and a 1. Can you do anything with that? Mum said it didn't mean anything to her either. I was disappointed at first. Then I mentioned that shortly before that, your daughter had shown herself riding a horse. The mum then looked at me in amazement and said, yes, shortly before her accident, she had won first place twice at a horse show. That was an indescribable moment for me. That was information that neither the medium nor I knew. So where could this information have come from? For me, that was extreme proof that there must be more to the whole story.
So you went to the girl's parents on the basis of your visit to the medium?
Yes, that's right. I actively contacted the parents, so to speak, even though I didn't know them either. But it was simply an inner impulse. And the deceased girl had also expressed the wish that I should also visit her parents. I then felt a bit like the contact person, as a way of re-establishing contact between Joma and her parents.
Most clients come to me because they're grieving and because they want to get in touch with someone who has died. And when the clients come to my practice, I can usually feel which deceased person is involved, even before the client arrives. I perceive emotions in my body. I notice how my character changes. I receive inner images from the spiritual world that do not come from my memory. And then I realize that I'm being prepared, so to speak, for the session that is about to take place. And as soon as the client arrives, there is a short preliminary talk, basically just for example, would you like some water, and to go to the toilet, and I will explain a bit about how my work works. And then I connect with the deceased in the spiritual world, and ask them to tell me about their life and any messages that are important for the client. And then I usually spend about 45 minutes telling them everything I receive in terms of images, feelings, memories, and messages for the client. And at the end, the client can ask 2 or 3 questions. Ideally, this is a healing session, so to speak, where the client really feels in their body that this can only come from my deceased loved one. Ideally, there are lots of details that you can't make up, that are really special messages, that are memories that only the 2 people share. And my intention is basically to bring a piece of healing into the world through the messages that this life doesn't end with death.
I received another very, very important piece of information from Nina Herzberg. Nina said that the girl was showing her that I had once been her father in a previous life, and that I had also had to witness her death in that previous life. And of course, that was a situation where a lot of things became clearer for me, because suddenly everything made sense.
The grief.
I felt this extreme grief, I felt this connection. And there was obviously a previous life where this connection came from. In other words, everything suddenly formed a picture for me. I understood that. And at that moment, when I was sitting with Nina Herzberg, I didn't question any of it. I would say that the critical scientist in me was on standby. I just felt and took it all in and accepted it completely. But then I drove home again by car. That's when the critical scientist came through again. And then I thought that this was an appointment with a woman who, of course, told me these very interesting things. That didn't mean that I had to take it all at face value. 2 or 3 weeks later, I went to see another medium. That's Bettina-Suvi here from the Ruhr area.
How did you come across this medium?
Nina Herzberg told me at the end of the city that Yoma would tell her, the girl's name was Yoma, that she would tell her that I should do a regression to find out more about this past life. Now, of course, you have to say that Nina Herzberg herself doesn't offer this, in case anyone suspects a business model or something. So, of course, I had this in the back of my mind. Okay, a regression. I need to find out more about my past life. I received an email. I don't usually receive promotional emails from any spiritual organizations or anything like that. But in this case, I received an email with spiritual advertising. Bettina-Suvi is organizing a seminar in Essen, in my hometown, on the subject of reincarnation. There are still 2 places available. I thought that was a hint. So, of course, I booked this seminar, and 3 weeks later, I was sitting in the circle of chairs at Bettina-Suvi's seminar. I was sitting right next to her. I was the last one in this round of introductions, and then I just said very briefly, "Hello, my name is Oliver, and I witnessed the accidental death of one of my daughter's classmates." At that moment, Bettina interrupted me and said, "Yes, and the girl is here. The girl says that you were her father in a previous life, and that you lost her in that life too. But you shouldn't experience that again in your current life." Then I was speechless, because suddenly the second woman, who was a complete stranger to me, told me the same story. In other words, Nina Herzberg on one side and Bettina-Suvi on the other. 2 mediums who don't know each other, definitely don't know each other.
I got to know Professor Oliver Lazar at a seminar where he was sitting next to me, and I could perceive the energy of a female child. This child then told me that he wasn't her father in this life, but he had been in a previous life. There's always a certain theme when I do seminars. This time it was the topic of reincarnation. Each participant tells something about themselves. Because Professor Lazar was sitting next to me on my left, and I started on my right side, he was the last one. I then turned around and said to him, "There's a little girl who says that she wasn't your daughter in this life, but she was in a previous life." And then I described her the way I perceived her. That's how it began.
An intensive collaboration followed. Finally, Oliver Lazar published a study on the effectiveness and authenticity of messages from the spirit. The results confirmed his conviction that mediumistic messages can be genuine. They often contain highly specific information and therefore have such a comforting effect. We can say with certainty, with great evidence, that consciousness survives the physical body. That is the most important thing. And above all, we've been able to establish this with objective verification. In other words, we didn't just interview 20 random people who then told us some kind of fanciful story and said, okay, that could be true, but we had 243 people. That's a considerable number. And yes, with so many people, you naturally also have a certain amount of evidence. It was an empirical scientific methodology that we used, and we were able to objectively verify this highly specific evidence. This is suddenly a completely new level of quality that we have achieved here. Mediums usually know nothing about how life in the afterlife might be organized. They see themselves as translators and are impressed by some cases themselves.
The case that recently touched me very deeply was that of a young woman who died in a motorbike accident. And the family had always been against motorcycling. And of course, I'm also a mother, and my son is currently getting his motorbike license. So I know these fears. She was a very, very active, charismatic young woman in her early 20s who had her entire life ahead of her. She had achieved and done an incredible amount, was constantly traveling, and I was very touched by her nature alone. And of course, her family also missed her incredibly because of her liveliness that was suddenly no longer present in everyday life, and because of the love that she brought into the world. I had the feeling that they couldn't cope with this loss in everyday life at all. And also with this kind of guilt, even if it wasn't their fault, the families, of course, but because it was a motorbike accident, they always felt a bit guilty. What would have happened if we had forbidden her to do it, if she hadn't ridden a motorbike? The subject of motorbikes always led to a kind of turmoil. And relatively quickly, the young woman stopped telling me details about her life and told me that I have to talk about death. I don't normally do that. I talk a lot about life first, then I talk about the cause of death and things related to it, and then I give the messages. That's the usual process. But it wasn't about me and my wishes. And after 10 minutes, the young woman showed me directly that she wanted me to talk about her death. I explained it to her family, said that she really wanted me to talk about her death, and that it was somehow special for her. And she gave me the feeling that she had overtaken and driven head into a lorry. To me, that was a horrible way to die, but she was gone immediately. She didn't really notice the dying process because it was so fast. She showed me that she was allowed to go home in one of the most beautiful moments of her life. And I still get goosebumps because she touched me so much and gave me this feeling that her death was what she wanted, that she wouldn't have wanted to die at any other time than at that very moment, doing what she loved most. And I think the way she showed me that, and the way I said it in her words, really touched the family, because only she would have expressed it in that way. And that was also something that relieved them of the guilt of the struggle with this motorbike issue. Oh, we should have been more careful. It was perhaps the wrong motorbike. We should have forbidden it. All these thoughts, they were suddenly gone in one fell swoop. And it was clear to everyone that this was what she wanted. In other words, that there was another level of her soul. Of course, as a human being, she didn't want to die at that moment. But if her soul knew on a soul level that she wouldn't live to be 100 or 60, but only live until her early 20s, then she would have actively chosen this death. Somewhere on a soul level, that was certain. And it really touched me, because I had the feeling that it isn't in our power, that so much was happening on another level, on the soul level, where we, the little ones, can't do anything. And I also had the feeling that this young woman's insane love and enthusiasm had continued. I don't make any contacts or deal with many issues afterwards in my everyday life, but I still feel them from time to time, and she shows me in an incredible amount of courage and joie de vivre that we should enjoy every day so much and take everything there is to take with us in this world. because this life was wonderful for her and she would never have wanted to live it in any other way.
With all perceptions that come about without the physical sensory organs playing a part, there is of course always the question of how to distinguish them from what are, so to speak, self-created thoughts, or you could also say imagination. How can you be sure that what you perceive with a certain objectivity is non-physical reality, and not just your own world of thoughts and imagination?
Basically, all perceptions also run through your own perception. So it's always, at least in some part, my words as well. And the spiritual world also works with my own memories. For instance, if I have to think about my relatives, I know that it's about the relatives of the deceased. And of course, that makes it incredibly difficult to differentiate whether they are memories or not. It's all about practice. In the beginning, it was really just these contacts, the practice contacts for clients where you really hear, yes, that's how it was. And afterwards, I also had people tell me what the situation was like, what it really looked like, exactly how the accident happened, in order to really learn which of my impressions was actually my translation and what came from the spiritual world. The spiritual world does not need time. The only thing that takes time is our imagination. The more I have to think about something, the more I know that my own thoughts are coming in. And I also talk incredibly quickly during the afterlife contacts, and recommend that clients record it, because many people can't keep up because I talk so quickly. But in that way, I can be very sure that my thoughts don't play a part, because I simply convey the first feeling, the first image, one-to-one, and it doesn't even have to make sense to me. I always make sure that I simply pass on what I get, without questioning whether it makes sense right now, whether it suits the client or not. And as a result, I now notice during my after-death contacts, it now flows much faster and more unfiltered. And topics that I don't actually have in my wealth of experience suddenly come through, and I say, well, I don't actually know that from my life or from my mind. I'm also experiencing a learning process in that way. You often have intuitions where you mentally ask a question. The spiritual world knows what I want to know, or what the client wants to know, and it's basically like a rattling. The images hit me in milliseconds, and sometimes it's rather difficult for me to choose which image is really important, and which is not an important message that will make an astonishing amount of sense to the client. What's really important for me is the preparation. The more I'm preoccupied with my own thoughts beforehand, the worse I am physically, the more worries or issues I may have myself, the more difficult it is to switch off completely during the contact and not bring my thoughts into it. So it's very important to me that I take several minutes, half an hour, for myself beforehand, and that I consciously switch on and off. As soon as I go from my private space into the practice, I switch off my own issues. I consciously leave all the things that have been bothering me behind me, and so to speak, consciously hand over all my wishes and everything that my ego would like over to the spiritual world. I'm just a channel. Everything that wants to be said is said, but I can neither contribute more nor less. I'm only an interpreter. I don't do anything. I basically just have to open myself up to what wants to be said. The soul doesn't know time and space in this context, but it can still reflect on where it is and where the body is. And I myself have trained my brain in a way that I can use it as my organ for translation. When a soul comes, I talk to it like I talk to you. Of course, that doesn't usually work, but I've trained my brain in a way that this kind of communication is possible, that meaningful content comes out of it. So I would say that if I were to draw it, I would draw a soul in the same way that a person's aura is depicted, for example. And the consciousness that I am, I realize that I'm sitting here, I'm moving my arms and legs, but there is someone sitting in this body. I perceive it like zeros and ones. It doesn't have a form. It's simply the precursor to something material.
Information.
Yes, that's a good word for it. Information, yes. That sounds so unromantic, but in a certain sense it is. As consciousness, that's how I experience it myself. I'm still there as consciousness without this body. But I can no longer feel many of the feelings that I can enjoy in this body and that are part of human life. That's why you should enjoy your time here.
Convincing mediumistic abilities often develop in connection with profound spiritual experiences, such as near-death experiences or after-death contacts. This results in the certainty that the actual reality lies beyond the dual physical world. And perhaps this experience awakens abilities that lie dormant in every human being.
Let's put it this way. We have resources with which we humans could perceive our surroundings in a more differentiated way, if we had learned to do so. It may not be possible for everyone to recreate images from another dimension, as I have told you, of souls visiting or when I come into contact with the aura of other people. That may not be possible for just anyone, because you're actually looking at a kind of screen outside of time and space. You can practice this, but not everyone will be able to do it. It also has to do with a basic disposition. I wouldn't say that I'm particularly enlightened. I'm actually someone who is very, very normal. Except for what I've always described as my little genetic quirk, because I think that basically everyone is born with psychic abilities. But in my case, it was simply pronounced, because I was always someone who was more in tune with nature, who was often a bit overwhelmed by people because too many emotions spilled over. Large crowds were somehow never my thing. So I like being in nature, I like being with myself, and in that respect, I think my abilities have traveled with me through my life without noticing them as anything special. I believe that as children, we are also much more connected to the spiritual world, and that a lot more people are aware of the spiritual world, but that this is then either trained out of us as adults, or we no longer are as open to it. I believe that, especially after a loss, many people who have never dealt with mediumship or the spiritual world really do feel it and receive signs from their deceased loved ones and are connected to the spiritual world and are somehow influenced by it. I believe that it protects us in terms of our life plan. They can't change everything around us, but they can try to support us in terms of our life plan. They can send us signs in which direction we should perhaps continue. They can give us courage. They come to us in dreams and help us to process things. I also often find that they simply send us people or events that make us wonder. I have asked myself something about this very topic, and then someone meets me and tells me something about it. So I notice this support and love from our deceased for the bereaved very, very strongly, even in everyday life. Not to the same extent every day, but if you open yourself up a little more, you can perceive it even more.
After-death contacts and mediumistic perceptions are extremely comforting. That is why they are also a topic for religiously orientated death researchers. If I, as a scientist, try to understand what the phenomenon of death is, I naturally have to address all phenomena in the vicinity of death, and then the phenomenon of mediumship is automatically a topic. Because, again, I say this quite neutrally, there are people who claim to perceive more than other people, who say, for example, that they can perceive the souls of deceased people, or, as they often say, the souls of people who are no longer living here. That's a bit different. And then the first task as a historian of religion is to look at where this phenomenon has already existed, in which cultural contexts, what it is like today. How do people claim it for themselves today? And how can this phenomenon be interpreted and dealt with? That's the general approach to begin with. And I can say for myself personally that I know a lot of people with mediumistic talents. In my scientific work at Kiel University, they would be the subject of observation for me, so to speak. At the moment, when I'm involved in my own church work, I ask myself what significance this phenomenon has for pastoral care and bereavement counselling, for example, in which I'm very much involved in voluntary work. And I've already had some very nice encounters with people who have mediumistic gifts and people who have really received very good support from them in a dying and grieving process.
Do you have the impression that these people truly have insights into the afterlife of some kind, based on your observations?
I have to explain my position again. I keep saying this in different contexts because it's difficult for people outside science to understand. As a scientist at Kiel University, I observe the phenomenon as neutrally as possible. And when I then leave the university and go into my very specific church work, I'm consciously no longer neutral, but stand by what I have personally developed as a conviction and belief. And then I say, yes, that does exist. There are people who can perceive other dimensions that are beyond our material world, that are characterized by the categories that we associate with space, time, and matter.
Sometimes the deceased come and say something with wit and humor. Oh God, I didn't believe in anything like that. But my bereaved does. Tell him he was right. That makes me laugh, because it's said with so much fun and humor. Or when someone who is very committed to religion actually comes and then says that it turned out differently. And I've seen many people who were afraid during the dying process, who were afraid of going through purgatory. And then told me afterwards that it was unfounded. The fear was so unfounded. Dying is actually easy. If we free ourselves and surrender to the process. And we are always picked up. There are so many people from the spiritual world, transitional helpers, who support us in the process. But our belief patterns sometimes make it difficult for us.
Messages from the spirit. Mediumistic messages. Studies confirm that the bereaved perceive them as comforting and are convinced of their reality. Nevertheless, many are skeptical and prejudiced about them. Petra Rahlfs therefore refrained from presenting herself as a medium for many years and made her skills available as a highly successful management consultant.
I always wanted to be normal. I didn't want to be the wizard Merlin or the witch Abraxas. I thought I couldn't do that. How great to be able to support strategy consulting, team composition. It was just so easy for me to say who didn't fit in the team.
Could you give a very specific example without naming names, but an example that illustrates how this works?
Yes. Of course, I'll go right back to my first CEO who invited me. That's a great example. He had chosen a successor, and he said that he had spent 40 years building up the company, and now wanted to hand it over to good hands. When he leaves, he naturally wants it to be the right person, someone who will continue everything in his name. And he said, there's no such thing. I chose this man myself, but the longer he's here, the less I like him. I don't know where that comes from. So, if you can help me with that. The man he chose as a successor had a 6-month or 1-year trial period, and he couldn't pinpoint where his reservations came from. I can still remember that today because it was one of those special experiences. I asked him a few things and was then able to describe to him that this successor, whom he actually wanted, was transgressive. in everything he did. When everyone wore a suit to the board meeting, because that is customary, he came with a turtleneck. Always little things like that. A smart turtleneck, but not with a tie like everyone else. And while everyone else went to their CEO across the corridor and spoke to him in person when there was something important, he just wrote an email. There were always little things like that provoked the house rules a bit. And I was able to make it clear to my customer that what he was defending was, I'll call it his ego. But we can take a look at whether this man is good for the company. I remember my client writing down transgressive and underlining it 3 times. I still remember that today, because it was a key experience he hadn't noticed it. Of course it bothered him, but should it really be relevant for his selection? I then asked him a few questions and was able to explain to him that this man who would soon be taking over his position was also leading the company into a different era. Previously, the company had always had a pull effect on its customers. In other words, it had approached them without doing anything. And the time when I was doing this consultancy was already more challenging. You had to push the boundaries on the outside in order to get the right customers and the right number of customers that the company needed. Crossing boundaries in a friendly manner and doing good for others, that was necessary. In other words, the future CEO had to have a completely different management style in order to lead the company to success. And he did lead it to success. But my client's day-to-day consciousness, or ego, somehow felt a bit offended, which was definitely the case, but it was a great choice for the company.
That means he actually chose the right person.
He chose the right one. He had a good gut feeling. This was a man who ensured the future of the company.
And also represented it.
Yes, and also represented the company properly. He was just personally annoyed because he wasn't wearing a tie.
Mediumship in secret. In a society that tends towards materialism and is skeptical about life after death, mediumistic contact with the afterlife is an esoteric fringe phenomenon. But beyond ideological prejudices, mediumistic abilities fit into a larger overall picture. They belong to the mental, spiritual essence of man, to his deepest inner being, the light of which can be experienced in near-death experiences, for example, and thus the feeling of a deep, loving connection with everything.
Because we all carry this light within us, but it sometimes appears to be covered up, as if there is a veil around it, we actually know this feeling at the deepest level. Some people experience it in the worst moments, when they really stop having an ego, because it is perhaps a very bad moment. Some people have already had the experience of being the light, and some experience this in the most beautiful moments. For me, it has something to do with giving up an inner defense or a will, more in moments when we are no longer holding on to the ego. Some people have it when they fall asleep, for example, because we have to let go a bit. Perhaps during an orgasm. Perhaps in some state where we no longer desire. Or in that flow state that some people describe when you're running. Running, and at some point you no longer realize that you're running, or you feel connected to your own light again, without really perceiving that this is my body, these are my emotions, these are my thoughts.
Is there life after death, an afterlife? Becoming more aware of your own inner world may bring you closer to an answer.